Welcome to the second edition of BIC Habba. We're very happy to uh, do a number of events through the day. Hall 1 and Hall 2, this is the seminar hall where we'll be having a series of discussions on the theme Bangalore, very broadly Bangalore. Last year, if some of you may have been here, last year we had an intensive sort of exploration on the history of Bangalore. We had 6 historians come and discuss various aspects of Bangalore. So we thought we'd continue, we'd keep that discussion going. And we have Professor Janaki Nair here, who's recently retired from JNU. People familiar with anyone who has the slightest interest in the history of Bangalore must have read her work. I mean, you can't not have read her work. She's published a few books, out of which, the 2 of which I've read. One is The Promise of the Metropolis, which is an exploration of Bangalore's history. Second is Mysore Modern, which interrogates the princely state of Mysore. So very happy to have Professor Janaki Nair. She's going to move to Bangalore, so we look forward to calling on her intellectual resources in the future as well. Along with Janaki, we have Meera Iyer. Again, anyone who's familiar with Intact knows Meera very well. She helms Intact in Bangalore. And she's written a lot of articles on Bangalore. I frequently read her work in the Deccan Herald. She's also the author of a new book, which I recently finished reading, Discovering Bengaluru, which is pioneering in a way because it's a guidebook as well as a history book. So I don't think there's any other book that works as a guidebook. So you can take and do these excellent walks. The only problem is then, I mean, if you take these books and walk around, we don't need to go on the Intact tours. So it's because these books by themselves are so thorough. So the conversation between Meera and Janaki will be moderated by Anup Naik, who's an architect with more than 25 years experience, and he's worked on some of the monuments in Bangalore. He's very familiar, so he's the appropriate person to do this. Thank you all. Over to Anup.
It's wonderful to be here and thank two massive people who've written about the city, who know the city by the back of their hand. Just to kind of a little... Yeah. I'm audible? I'm audible? Yeah. Janaki, born and brought up in the city, and Meera, you've adopted the city. What are your early memories of the city?
It's wonderful to have an opportunity to talk about early memories, and I'm a teacher in a university, so I'm not somebody who minces words or keeps my comments short. We usually hold nothing less than 2-hour lectures, but I'll try to be brief. I won't go on for 2 hours. But one could go on for 2 hours about how Bangalore was. One doesn't want to indulge, and I swore when I was young that I'll never talk like this. I'll never talk about the good old days. But we all do it. They were the good old days. And I have actually written about this very briefly in Aditi Dey's book. Very briefly. Grew up in Bangalore. In fact, I grew up at a junction which is probably unrecognizable today, which is the junction of Church Street and St. Mark's Road, opposite Koshi's. So I was but it was nothing like this. I mean, my brother and I counted cars because they were so rare. They passed us only once every half hour or so. It was possible to write down those numbers, the registration numbers of the cars. That's how few cars there were. It was not a city that was highly populated. It was not a city that was distinguished in any way, apart from a few. I mean, we went to school down the road, so, everything was in your neighborhood. You walked to school. I ended up actually walking to college as well because I studied at St. Joseph's College. it was still a place that was walkaboutable because the pavements were really large and free of any encroachments that are today the bane of my life. So let me start with one comment, if I might, Meera, on your book. You have enjoined us to be flanners. And that's such a lovely thought. But where are the pavements? You know, how do we... I actually took the opportunity yesterday, Meera, of following one of your walks, the Alsur walk. And I have to tell you that especially at my age, I was more worried about whether I'll trip and fall than look at things around me. There is no pavement. You know how the pavements have disappeared in the last 40 years or so. So I don't need to tell you the time I'm remembering is the time of a city that was within walking distance, and if not walking distance, definitely cycling distance. And these were the activities that you do. Very frequently people went, I know this old friend of mine, she was almost 60 when she was working at an office on Rainier Street, and she used to walk back for lunch to Lavelle Road every day. You know, this is how the city was. You walk back for lunch, go back, so 4 times a day you're doing this trip. I don't want to sound nostalgic, but there you are. That's one strong memory that I have, and that is really a loss that has happened. That there are 2 ways in which that has been challenged. One, the city has grown beyond the reach of your legs, and the second is, of course, that there are no pavements. So, you know, in both senses, we have lost that pedestrian quality to this city.
Meera, your thoughts?
I was not born in Bangalore, just a clarification, but I did grow up here. And interestingly enough, my early memories of the city are also to do with walking to school and to the markets. And so I've actually grown up in different parts of the city. So I've grown up in Baswangudi, I've lived a while in Fraser Town, and I've lived a while also in Austin Town. And Jayanagar, of course, also. So in all these areas, I know these streets because I've actually walked along them. And along with the walking to school or wherever it was, there are other things that were part of this memory. One is the trees, the street trees especially, but also trees in the gardens that that bordered the roads. And a third thing was the buildings. The old houses that we used to pass, like on my way from Victoria Road, walking down to school, we used to go past Castle Street, and sometimes we used to go past Wood Street, and we used to, even as children, we used to drool at all those old houses that used to be there, most of which are gone now. So these also are definitely a part of the reason I wrote this book, because it's impossible not to fall in love with the city that you have walked about in. And this is really, again, one of the reasons that the book is structured the way it is, which is it's encouraging people to walk so that you actually fall in love with the city. I agree with you that it's not easy because of the pavements. But the other thing, I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but one of the other reasons, the main reason that the book has been published is for people, I think when you know about a place, you can't look at it the same way again. When you know something about the story of a place, the story of a person who lived there, the story of why a building was built the way it was, or some event that happened along the street that you're walking on, you can never really look at it the same way again. You sort of, you have a relationship with it, you kind of almost own it. So, and when that happens, you do actually feel for it. And when you feel for it is when you can actually do something about it. So, yes, there are no footpaths, but if enough people care about the city, we will ask for them and something will happen. That's like the eternal optimist in me. I think something will happen for the better.
This leads, I'm sure that because of your neighborhood and living in multiple neighborhoods in the city, it was just, I get a feeler that in the way you've written your book or in the way you've structured your book, that it crafts its way through neighborhoods, streets, memories, people's stories, and that leads to the Pete, Cantonment, Cubbon Park, Alsur, Baswangudi, the various towns and towns, if you look at the way the city is structured. Then you talk about the Keres as well as you speak about the Keres, you speak about Lal Bagh, and there's a very distinctive process in this narrative. What prompted you to kind of stitch this narrative from largely reading the city as sets of neighborhoods?
So as Vicar said earlier in his introduction, anyone who's interested in the history of the city at all has read Janaki's books. And there are lots of these really excellent books about the city, which have been written over the last so many years. Harini Ragendra has written about nature in the city.
Ecology.
Yeah, ecology and nature in the city. And there are other people who, Fazlul Hassan, who has also written in the past about the city. But there are no stories about local neighborhoods of the city. And this is why the book is structured the way it is, because I wanted to tell the story of these neighborhoods, which together tell the story of the city. So in a sense, it is sort of a hyper-local history book.
Largely a collective idea.
Yes.
In fact, Janaki, sure. Please.
No, I was going to respond also to this. I think the model, though, for your book is an international one, in the sense that there is this interest in neighborhoods and walking tours and so on and so forth, and they usually choose specific neighborhoods. I know there is a book by Swapna Little for Delhi, and it's very similar. Of course, Delhi is a monumental city, so in that sense, it's tracked around the monuments. But there is an international model for locating your guided tours on the basis of neighborhoods. So would you say that's true also of your book, that you have drawn on that? I mean, to some extent?
Certainly, I've drawn on the ideas to a certain extent. And yes, like you said, Delhi has this lovely book also on themed around different walks that you can take. So, and to step back a bit, the idea for the book did happen because of the walks that we conduct in the neighborhood, around the city rather, around different neighborhoods through INTAC. And on many of these walks, we would be asked by people, why don't you write a book about this? Because it would reach so many more people. So this is what prompted us to work on the book as it is. But I would say that, yes, there are plenty of books, actually, if you just Google London walks or Paris walks. All of these are actually books guided, based around different walks. But I think maybe partly because of my interest in history, this book is certainly much more history heavy. Not heavy, how should I put it? It talks a lot more about the history than merely what you can see. So there is a lot in the book based on tangible stuff, things that you can see in front of you, but there's also a lot of backstory to each, not just place, but also the neighborhood itself. So I think it's a little more focused on history than many other books that are structured around walks, which is why I wouldn't really call it a guidebook, because a guidebook normally doesn't really have so much emphasis on the story of a city.
This leads me on to Janaki, your book, The Promise of the Metropolis. You chose 3 levels of analysis. One, you spoke about the conceived city, and then there was a perceived city, and spatial practice. And how did this whole premise for this analytics begin?
Actually, that is taken from the typology that was developed by Henri Lefebvre, who's this French sociologist of the city. And I found it appropriate to think in terms of not just how cities are planned, but also how they are given meaning through human action. And this need not be action that is necessarily in tandem with the intentions of builders. And I'm sure this is something you've encountered in your work as well. So I was interested in this idea that places are given meaning well beyond how they are conceived in terms by technical people such as architects and others, how they are given meaning in terms of how those very buildings and the urban fabric is perceived. But more importantly, what are the kinds of practices that emerge around spaces which are unanticipated? They may not be always anticipated uses of space that are happening. And I think that's what's exciting about the city, that there are uses to spaces that are completely unanticipated. And they don't leave any material or physical trace. So, how do you get to that history? How do you try to understand that aspect of the life of a city. Because finally, the life of the city is obviously not only in its structures and its roads and its physical material features, but also in its mental imaginative ones. And what is the imagination that surrounds aspects of the city? So this was a kind of logic that drove that book. I have to say though that despite the fact of claiming that I'm a person who's born and bred in Bangalore, I am radically estranged from the city. And I think that's also a useful thing in the sense that it's good to have distance, and it's good to have critical distance in order to be able to study the city. So while others might use terms like love and so on and so forth, I will use the term of critical distance to talk about my relationship to the city.
This, in fact, leads to how we as public, I think, generally look at this idea of soft urbanism and appropriating space. Do you think that is the way the city can be read? I'm saying this is for both of you all. This idea of temporal urbanism continuously happening. And there is a sense of, let's say you take the Karaga. Karaga comes in, then you appropriate space. You have Eid, and then Eid during Ramzan, then space is appropriated differently. Markets pop up. So is this idea of temporal urbanism is distinct to this city, or is one of the markers in which the people's story kind of get established more stronger?
Yeah, that's exactly the kind of question that I was interested in. That is the temporary occupations of space, which is intended for other purposes. And what kind of meanings? It's not specific to Bangalore at all. Although we have the Karaga, and I'm always surprised that many people live in Bangalore for years and never even once visit this extremely important, very urban festival, because it is something for which people come from surrounding villages. It's an unusual festival in that sense, because people are actually coming to Bangalore for the Karaga, which has now become a municipal event, actually. It's been taken over the municipality. So it is not particular to Bangalore at all. I mean, that's the short answer. There are many other aspects to the temporality of urban life, for which, if I might be given a chance, I'll take the example of Delhi. Delhi during the odd even, which is the pioneering idea of the AAP government, was a completely different city from what it was imagined or conceived. And it was a dream city in that sense. It was almost a utopic space, because suddenly the traffic was halved and you felt you could breathe outside on the streets and you could move around more easily. You had a chance actually to admire things which you would not, because you're always dealing with dense traffic. So I'm saying that there are all kinds of such moments in cities' histories which are extremely important to document, and that would be actually one thing that I want to say about your book also. As important to document as the built form. The built form is, of course, very important to document, especially because it's disappearing at such a fast pace today. So we need some record of that as well. But I would say even these temporary forms of occupation, the Kalakai Parishe, the Karaga, these are all classically Bangalore events. And
the Avrakai festival, which happens, Temporal. I think that's a very interesting way in which we celebrate the city. In fact, this leads me to another. Please.
But to add to what you said, apart from the Karaga and all these festivals, I think there are other unanticipated ways in which people have used spaces. So if you look at, for example, KR Market, and the way it was planned as this very colonial-looking market, built by the Mysore government, yes, but in the pattern of other markets around the city, around the country, built at that time. But the way it is used and the way the roads in front are used, with the flower market just spreading everywhere and the Sunday bazaar stretching on all onto Avenue Road, I think these are also things which are definitely adding to the, as you said, I mean, these are also different kinds of urbanism which definitely need to be studied and they need to be recorded. And I have not dwelt much on them in my book, but they do definitely enter into, in some ways, in some places, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, leading from this whole idea of tactile urbanism, if you may want to call it as, it actually leads to one important phase of our Bangalore's history. And you clearly mentioned that this patriotic production, I think, in your book, about how the public sector companies, and that might be the break of, let's say, 1950s, 54 onwards, when ITI, HAL, BEL, all these public sector companies came. Might be that was a seed of actually making the city far more cosmopolitan, if I may use that. But let's say these were growth engines. This actually set a piece for the growth engines. A lot of places outside the so-called city, if you take the Pete Kote and Kant, these areas started getting developed. But parallel to what Meera talks about is these urban villages, these villages which were there, started getting engulfed into the urban environment. So we see two parallel stories. One, the villages getting absorbed into the urban environment, and the formation of new economy. So was a new script written for Bangalore during that time?
You know, let me back up a little here, and in fact that was also going to be my request to INTAC to document the history of its engagement with production. Now, Bangalore has by and large bypassed smokestack industrialization. We did not go through that sort of phase like other cities, you know, Kanpur, Ahmedabad, Bombay, Calcutta. We did not go that route of, we had a few industries, I've written about them, that is Binnies and ITC and so on. They're exceptional. They're not necessarily the defining feature of the production landscape in the colonial period. So we had a very sluggish industrial profile landscape in the colonial period. It's really, as you rightly said, in the 40s. But let me also back up here and say one of the most continuous forms of production, an unbroken heritage, if you like, is the production of textiles. It's from handlooms, of course, to power looms, but it is that sound of looms in Kavanpet which is unmatched by any other city one might visit, where, you know, there is really an unbroken tradition of at least 3 or 4 centuries in terms of what is produced in the old city area. That apart, it is really in the 40s that one sees this massive move forward, and it is, you're right, it is in the public sector industries which come up from 48 onwards, and they are actually all located, if you look at old maps of that time, on the edges of the city. So what has happened in Bangalore is actually these units which are located on the edges of the city being succeeded by a period of what we might call infilling. So the space between the main, what you say, Pete Kote and cantonment being filled up. And this might be through the urbanization of villages. In my own work, I've looked at the ITI and the surrounding areas for that development, but that is repeated in almost every quarter. So certainly, you know, as new areas come up, they're urbanizing. I myself know Binamangla village, for instance. Domlur was a village. Some of those names have remained, but they have also changed more recently. And this is a very important aspect of any history of any city, where it engulfs villages, transforms them, retains some features of the village, but mostly it is like, you know, urbanizing these villages. So I was really thrilled to learn from your book, actually, things which I didn't know, like, for instance, the Bireshwara temple that you talk about, and the Kalyani, which is in Sampaigram Nagar, which I was not actually aware of. So there is so much if you go into the fabric of neighborhoods, as Meera's book so wonderfully points out. So in that sense, it's a meticulous documentation of neighborhoods and you know, structures that have come up there. And if I might be given another minute, I want to say one thing that I appreciate this book for, and that is that it's attention to detail. I think this is something that is sorely lacking in our educational system, that we are not trained to think visually. And I think the way in which this book guides us to look at features of buildings, look at architectural features, motifs, things that are meaningful, things that are harking back to stock repertoire of images, when it's a temple image, for instance, and so on, is a very valuable kind of pedagogic, role that this book is playing. So, I mean, I must say, I really appreciate that aspect of this book.
Your take on this urban villages and getting
So,
converted?
I think this idea of, Janaki mentioned the public sector undertakings being located on the outer edges of the city, but that kind of thing, even if you go back earlier, like if you look back to the time when the plague happened, or even before the plague in 1898, even if you go back to the 1880s when the city was expanding, then generally these new layouts, as they're called, or the extensions of the city, they were located a little bit away from the Petekote, a little bit away from the cantonment. If you look at Fraser Town, there was this village, Paparedipalya, which was then converted into Fraser Town. And this was a little distance away from the centers of population. In fact, this is one of the reasons why, whether it was when Basavangudi was formed or when Fraser Town was formed, people weren't really willing to move there because it was all of like 3 kilometers away, who's going to move so far, and how will we get there, and all of this was happening, no? So, and in between, so Fraser Town was there, and the rest of the C&M station is here, and then in between you have, like she said, the infill, no? So that is something that has been happening a lot, but it is interesting, like in many other cities, where a lot of the village does still stay on in the city, which is what is so fascinating. So,
where I was heading to is that each of these villages have very distinct stories. Were you able to trace them, or is there an opportunity to write the next book on that?
well, that's an idea. Let me say, okay, there were some cases where I could, where there were distinctive histories of the village that were important to the entire neighborhood as well. So one chapter, which is about the area around Sampangiram Kere, which was written by Hita Unikrishnan and Harini Nagendra, that actually does trace out the history of that village, of that settlement, and its place in the larger story of the city, of Bangalore itself. But that is not the case in all of them. In some places, there are fragments of things. You may see a katte here or like a dhobi cart there. But then, to be honest, I have not really explored those connections in all places.
This leads me to, if you look at the city, it's always been looked at as a piece of real estate. Now, and even going back to actually the very interesting anecdote from her book, she talks about Shivaji's brother Ekoji sold the city to the Wadayars for 3 lakhs. So I'm thinking this whole transactional nature in the city has, it's been going back to as much as Shivaji's time. You also look at later, probably the way Whitefield happened. Whitefield was also a farm plot scenario. So, and Janaki, you also speak about this idea of corridor urbanism, and as how corridors now pick up like your ring roads and peripheral ring roads, and you name them. There are enough number of roads in the city which are leading out. So, what are your views on this new layer?
You're asking me?
Yeah, and then I lead on to.
Yeah, here I would like to slightly correct what you said. The idea of transfer of city space, or any space for that matter, by a regime, from one regime to another, like you gave the example of Ekoji, is not the same as what happens under what the broad rubric of capitalism. What we are witnessing is the city that is being overrun by a singular logic of real estate. And therefore, you have, I think this comes through in your book very well, this tension between an interest in the history of the city, which certainly is true of large numbers, particularly all those who are flocking to the city and want to know more about it, and a complete sort of indifference to the preservation of its heritage. I think it comes out very clearly in your book that, you had to look for somebody's dargah under garbage and so on and so forth. So, this indifference to the built heritage is, of course, coming out of the logic of capitalism in the city, and the fact that it is all about accumulation by dispossession, and only the logic that actually places an incashable value on land is operating. Now, but on this question of the corridor urbanism, what is interesting that is happening in a place like Bangalore today is not just the conversion of all places. I have spoken about this with reference to the lakes, which are disappearing under the logic of the real estate market. Corridor urbanism is referring to a new stage, which is described by Michael Goldman as speculative urbanism. That is to say, you're buying real estate not necessarily to live there or to inhabit it for yourself, and I think that is definitely a new stage, but that you're speculating on who might actually find this valuable property to occupy and so on. So I think that is definitely a new stage in this history of capitalism within the city, which we are witnessing now. Of course, we may have tanked off. I think there's been so much overbuilt areas in Bangalore. One is here. I don't know the statistics for this, but I'm told that there is a lot of, building that is happening, which is unoccupied and unsold and so on and so forth. I don't know the truth of this, but I'm willing to believe it because there has been such rampant and just, there has been this uncontrolled overbuilding of the speculative kind. So that I would say is definitely a new feature. That's what I would say is the new feature.
From the idea of the real estate component. And Meera, you've encountered this as part of the research base, what you all went through for the book? And I'm sure because there's a lot of pressure from buildings being knocked down, restructured, or reuse happening. So are those indicators what you see now?
Yeah, so I'd like to share an anecdote here, which I've spoken about in a couple of places. But this is a time going back to, I think, 3 or 4 years ago when there was a move to demolish a lot of markets around the city, including Johnson Market and Russell Market and Cubbon Pet Market and several others, 18 markets around the city which were to be demolished and replaced by mall-like markets. So there was a campaign that was organized around this to say that this should not happen and that these markets could actually be rejuvenated and restored, and maybe there could be different kinds of uses. There could be markets plus other things happening in them. So as part of this, my colleague Arvind and I, we had gone to meet the officials from the BBMP department that looked after markets, and we were talking to him about Richard Square, which is one of the markets which was to be redone. And Richard Square, if you know, it's like this nice open area and ringed by these lovely old shops. And it's one of the few open places in that area. It's also very interesting because you can actually see sparrows there still. Apart from BIL, apart from the airport, I think this is one of the few places we can actually still see gubachis, like sparrows. So there are sparrows there, and then there's this wholesale tomato market that happens and all of this. So we spoke to the person in charge of markets at BBMP about all this, and his reaction was like on a totally different level. He was looking at it purely as so much open space, so much can be built, So definitely there is that. I mean, everybody knows this, that there are different ways we are looking at things entirely, and it is always a struggle because it's not just the officials. Even you mentioned about buildings being pulled down. So there's also another practical side to it, which is that several of these old buildings, when they're owned by families which move out or which need the money, so they need to be sold. So this thing of real estate is always there breathing down our necks, and it's always like, it's something you come up with constantly. It's not something I see much of in earlier stories of the city. I mean, it's really stark the way people have looked at things very, very differently, even from the 1920s or 1930s or 1940s. There's a stark difference that I feel is there.
Let's put ourselves 20 years ahead, and if both were asked to write a book, what would be the narrative?
You first.
What would be the narrative? Something similar, but I have to say, I'm hoping if I do write another book in 20 years, I hope it'll be much fatter, because I'm hoping that there'll be much more interest in the city, and there'll be many more neighborhoods to explore, and there'll be, I hope, more of heritage that has been restored or that is being celebrated and therefore can be written about. There were several things around the city, even structured around our walks, which we had to leave out of the book simply because there wasn't enough for people to see. It's there, but you need to look for it. But I hope that 20 years down the line, we don't have to look for it so much. There's more visible, I hope.
And you, Janaki?
I'm going to divide this into two because I had something to say about this interest in history that seems to be so visible. I mean, your book is one symptom of that, but there is a lot of interest. We were talking about it before we came in here. There is newspaper interest in neighborhoods. There is popular interest. People want to know more about the city at an informational level. So, you know, can we go beyond that informational level? Can we ask more challenging questions about what kinds of civic ideals certain built forms actually promote, inculcate, or communicate? And I think there are examples in our recent past, especially the colonial past, that might actually, and coming back to the public sector as well, I would give the example, for instance, of Murphytown. That was a very deliberate attempt to elevate the self-respect of cobblers who were working for the army. There was a very deliberate way in which that was designed to produce that kind of, you don't see many traces of it anymore. In fact, I think it's more or less obliterated because that was also built around quite large open squares and low-rise housing, of course, but they were meant for people who needed to be taught or needed to be encouraged to have a different self-conception. And that was an interesting thing popping out in the middle of the colonial period. So it's like trying to develop some kind of new civic ideal. I think the public sector industrial township is another such effort at producing new kinds of citizens. And I think when one reads public sector documents, one is struck by not just the imagination, but the hope that was expressed that these industrial townships would produce a new kind of human being, someone who is, of course, patriotic in this productive sense, but also learning from living with all kinds of people from all over the country. So the public sector was seen as some sort of university in itself, you know, where you learn from living with and inhabiting spaces that with people whose habits and languages and cultures you are not familiar with. So there was a very deliberate attempt in that space to produce a new kind of citizen. And so, you know, as I said, I'm so struck by the fact that somehow people coming to Bangalore these days want to know this information about the past. But I'm just going to read one little quotation of what look at me, Nehru said in 1962 when he inaugurated, he was addressing members of the Bangalore Municipal Corporation. Here is what he said, and this is what was promising about Bangalore. Most of the cities in India remind one certainly of the present, certainly of the future, but essentially of the past. But Bangalore, as I said, more than any other great cities of India, is a picture of India of the future. More specifically because of the concentration of science, technology, and industries in the public sector here. Most of the old cities represent history, whereas your great city represents the future we are molding. In addition to its representation of the future, it is also one of the most beautiful cities of India. Now, I'm reading this out precisely because I think we have to go beyond the nostalgia. I think we have to attempt to document the city's, efforts at producing new kinds of citizens, what has happened to this, what are the meanings that people have made of spaces, as I said, in this occupational sense. It may not always be a story that pleases us, so it may not actually please those who want to know only about beautiful buildings and so on. We need to also tackle the uncomfortable questions of the kinds of occupations of public spaces that have happened by shrines and by auto rickshaw stands with their Rajkumar flags and so on and so forth. We need that story. We need to have a fuller, richer account of what the city is, with its, while on the one hand celebrating its heritage, but also thinking about, look at that. I mean, this was seen as a space of hope, as something that will give to India something completely new. By this time, by the way, I should inform you that Nehru was definitely getting impatient with this baggage that we were saddled with of the past. Hence Chandigarh. And that's the same kind of optimism he expressed around Chandigarh. But I'm saying this only because such a different view of the city, and yet here we are actually celebrating a kind of a different moment in the city's past. I think, can we bring these two together? This idea that, Bangalore was a city of hope, of the future, and this very rich past as well. Is there some way in which one can bring it together?
Well, that is actually something that we are constantly trying to do, because unfortunately many people have read this idea of Bangalore as a city of the future to mean it has zero past. And so it's something we're constantly battling against. So I really hope these two will in future come together much better than they are now.
Yeah.
And I'm sure we're running out of time. Can some questions from the public, from people sitting around?
Janaki, you spoke about the public enterprise and how they were visualized as bringing in a new kind of culture. So you're saying that is documented, and if so, what happened to it? I mean, did it actually happen? Do people go back to it and say it didn't happen, and if so, why, and so on?
Okay, so the archival material to which I'm referring is a committee of public undertakings and their vision of these industrial townships. Certainly it happened in terms of actually a built form. So if you go to ITI, I don't know if it still exists, you will see the township, Durrani Nagar. Right? Is it still there?
Still
because
there.
I know HMT and all have been dismantled to some extent. Am I correct? Not? It's derelict, at least. It's derelict. I've walked through HMT, so I know that some parts of it are derelict. But so certainly these townships were built using the principles of that vision. What use people put to it, what actually emerged, certainly, again, I have the accounts of early BL workers who have recalled very much that moment of the 60s when they felt that they were part of this new world, this new India, as it were. Certainly things have changed a lot, and part of the reason is that the public sector itself has been dismantled to a certain extent. BEL, for instance, more or less gone. So again, it's the logic of real estate that is actually approaching. Binny Mills, I mean, I wanted to have some kind of, labor and industrial museum located in Binny Mills. That was my dream, and it didn't happen because, I think it was really wonderful to have people go through older machinery and so on and so forth, understand the old. So coming back to your point, yes, it was built. There were people who actually lived that dream, at least for some time. That it has sort of become less visible or invisible. Nobody denies that that was a hope of that moment. But certainly it has been, in some ways, undone by forces of the market, by forces of the fact that the public sector itself has been undermined very strongly by the withdrawal of the state and so on. So there are other reasons why this is perhaps not as visible as it should have been.
Can I make a comment on that? I mean, I grew up in Jalahali in an Air Force campus, which is always, cleaned and swept and very, everyone was disciplined and orderly. And right next to us was HAL, and right next to us was BEL. And they were all, and we kids at school, we had a kind of understanding, and they bussed us Air Force kids into town, and it was all so clean. And the dirtiest parts of Bangalore were the city market, and we said, so somehow there was this big difference between cantonment area, the central Bangalore, all these HAL again, which was associated with the Air Force, very, very clean and well-kept townships. And so then you suddenly have a Bangalore where all that civic sense has gone. Yeah, so that's, and become a slum.
I don't think the civic sense was limited to the public sector townships. I think there was very much a civic sense even in other parts of Bangalore, such as Basavangudi, Janagar, Malleshwaram.
Of course.
All of
course,
those as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And those, I think, again, were very planned, weren't they? Because of the avenues and the
Of
parks,
course.
and there was very
Yeah,
much,
yeah.
because they were for families, and they were
Yeah.
for...
So IT has played a major role in Bangalore. How has that affected the layout of the city?
In terms of the layout of the city, it really hasn't affected the core because it's, again, most of the, all these infotech parks, for example, have actually come on the outskirts, except in the case of Whitefield, where actually it is within, it is right next to the historic settlement of Whitefield, and unfortunately most people don't even know that there is an older part of Whitefield. But otherwise, in terms of layouts of the city itself, I really don't think it has affected it particularly.
Like the army and cantonment areas developed a certain kind of ethos. So what role
So,
does IT play?
I think one thing that you see more of, not just in Bangalore, but maybe it's really visible here, is something that there's a lot more of this. There was this historian who wrote about Los Angeles some years ago, and he called something, he used this term called Fortress LA, which was really talking about alienation of public space and this move towards gated communities. I think that we're seeing much more of here in Bangalore. There's this move towards everything being privatized, including public space, and walled in, yeah. So I think, unfortunately, we're seeing much more of that with, from, like, say, the 1990s onwards.
Both Janaki and Meera, you seem to have done a lot of chronicling of the growth of the cities over past. And because of that, you sit at a vantage point to maybe also extrapolate that knowledge to predict the city's movement to future. But what we understand as planners is there are two kinds of cities, one of which are planned cities, the Brasilia or the Chandigarh, for example. And they're planned so they're fixed entities of an idea, and people are supposed to fit into that idea. And then there are most organic cities, like all our cities, right from Banaras to Bangalore. You see cities which are continuously growing and evolving. So when you read out Nehruji's talk about a vision of a new modern city being formed here, the idea was there were certain thoughts which would drive the city, the economy, and its pedagogy. What has happened, as our friend here said, suddenly there was a boom of IT and new thoughts, new paradigms, and new utilitarian spaces came up. What we saw in Kant as sparsely built areas, disciplined spaces, has been taken over by small, minuscule shared spaces, co-living spaces, co-working spaces. So the idea of city as what we've chronicled or studied, and the idea of a future city from a young man's perspective who's now 20, would be 50 when you write your next book, maybe, like 40, 20 plus 20, sorry. So 40. A lot of fundamental parameters of public spaces, interactive spaces, open domains, personal spaces would change. How do you predict that of all the cities, would Bangalore catch up to the vision of youngsters' modern city, or would it still be struggling with its continuous problems of commute and pollution and all what we constantly keep blaming the city for?
The first part of your question, I should just add that actually Bangalore is also very much a planned city. Even if you go back to the oldest part of it, which is like the Pete area, it is very much a planned Pete area. So, no, even earlier, even if you go back to its establishment as a capital in the 1500s, it was planned as a capital city. It wasn't a village that grew into, there were sets of villages, but as a capital city, it was actually a planned area. So with areas set aside for certain professions and things like that. So It's not that it was an unplanned city. So from that time, even the various extensions that have happened, not just the CNM, not just the cantonment area, but even the other areas like Malleshwaram, for example, they've all actually been planned quite well. So that apart, your question was what? Like how, what was the last line again, sorry?
The preparedness of the city. Like, for example, we have planning bodies which don't plan. And there are public, private builders who build as per their plan. The city primarily moves away from the urban master plan or the vision of BBMP or BDA to develop to what a Divyashri or a Mantri or somebody would develop in. So how do you see the preparedness of the city 20 years down the line when the parameters of a city would change, the very idea of a city? For the youngster, for example, it's no longer a house and a school and walking to school. For the youngster, it is co-living spaces, co-working spaces, nothing more, ordering on the phone. It's a very limited space. So his interaction with public domain is very limited because he's mostly in a cocoon.
Yeah, so I think there are actually a lot of people who are working to ensure that the kind of thing you're talking about, this sort of dystopian thing where you're only working, where you're only limited to your co-working space, does not happen. So, I mean, Ravi, who is associated, Ravi Chandar, for example, is one of those people. But there are, my point is, there are a lot of minds, a lot of people putting a lot of thought into the city. And, you know, one of the things about the city is how creative it is. So there are a lot of creative minds thinking about how not to have this dystopia happen. So I really think we are muddling along, we're sort of growing this chaotic organism right now, but I really think it will not be all as bad as what you are portraying.
So I would actually like to respond to that. I mean, both these very interesting questions of how has IT reconfigured the city and, you know, has it left a more positive mark actually on the urban fabric is a question that we may legitimately ask. So we are at a moment, first of all, I don't agree with you that there are planned cities which have worked. The fact is the planned city also comes to grief because they are set in a hinterland where there's continuous migration. You cannot have a fully planned city unless you have some way of undemocratically stopping that migration, which we don't do. The fact is that they come to the city for reasons of opportunities, and that's a fact of life. So, you know, we can't produce Singapore. That mistaken belief that we can somehow reproduce Singapore is false. Singapore does not have any of the problems of the hinterland that we continuously face. So it's not even true that the so-called planned areas, whether it's Brasilia or Chandigarh, are successes. What we are witnessing today is actually the failure of planning law, of course, as you already know. But we are witnessing actually a moment in our city's history where people have privatized not just public spaces and, you know, withdrawn, as it were, into a very private life, whether it is in apartments or in gated colonies or whatever it is. But they have also privatized their modes of communication. So one massive shift has to happen away from private modes of communication to public modes of transport. Now, how do you enable that? Not just through infrastructure. I think some of it is infrastructure. But there has to be a real, or I would say a very penal law that punishes people for taking out private vehicles. Short of that, you're not going to enable this shift. And as I said, the odd even is a good example of this. It's because of the fine that people actually stopped taking. The first round of odd even, people still took their vehicles out. Then the fine increased. And in the last round, I'm happy to say people were actually willing to comply even without thinking of the fine. So, you know, that shift has to happen from away from the private to the public, at least in terms of enabling good transportation, which is more, you know, evenly priced and also available to people and so on. There are some examples. Curitiba in Brazil is a famous example of a mayor who has taken this forward, and that has happened in some other cities as well. How do we have, okay, so how I'm being stopped here from my lecture mode. So I'll just end this by saying you have to have that shift.
Okay, I think we are running out of time. Just that we can probably have this chat outside this. Just to sum up, I think of our conversation today, the city is made of neighborhoods which come alive with its history, stories, myths, legends, anecdotes, and facts. And when you know about something, you automatically understand it. When you understand it, you appreciate it. And when you appreciate it, you're actually willing to do something positive for the city. Thank you so much for being with us and hearing us out. Thank you so much.